Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 bestselling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, we have a very special guest for you today, Stephen Kinzer. Stephen Kinzer hails from my alma mater. I went to Brown University, and Stephen Kinzer is a professor at Brown University in international relations. He's also the author of not one, but 9 books. And we're going to be speaking with him today about his book, Poisoner in Chief: Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. You can find out more about Stephen Kinzer and his very important work at his website, stephenkinzer.com. Welcome, Stephen Kinzer.
It's good to be with you. It's a great subject and a wonderful conversation partner.
So thank you so much for being here. And Stephen Kinzer, first of all, will you share for our audience, what is your book, Poisoner in Chief, about?
So, as you said, I'd written 9 books before this. This is my 10th book. I'm always looking for stories that were very important and helped shape the world, but that for whatever reason have dropped out of history or have never been told. Now, in the course of writing my books, I've come up with a lot of material that's very surprising. And it's material that's shocked some people. But this is the first time I have been shocked. I still can't wrap my mind around the fact that there was such a program at the CIA called MK Ultra, and that there was such a person as Sidney Gottlieb, this deep cover, highly anonymous figure who ran that program. So what is the book about? In the early 1950s, the CIA became convinced, mistakenly as it turned out, that communist countries, particularly the Soviet Union and China, might be working on techniques of mind control. These guys had grown up with Edgar Allan Poe stories and Sherlock Holmes and lots of movies like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and hypnotism ideas, and they took these seriously. So when they got this idea, mistakenly, as I said, that the Soviets were close to solving the riddle of mind control, they went into a kind of panic mode. They realized something that's probably true, which is that if you could find a way to control everybody's mind, then you could rule the world. So the CIA decided, we have to go out and launch a crash program, no matter how many lives it takes or how much it costs or what it requires, to find the secret of mind control. They hired this chemist, Sidney Gottlieb, to direct this ultra secret program, which is why it was called MK Ultra. Again, I repeat, if you could succeed in this program, the prize would be nothing less than world mastery. So Gottlieb, as a good scientist, decided that before he could find a way to implant a new mind into somebody's brain, he had to find a way to destroy the mind that was in there. And he spent years carrying out the most gruesome and intense experiments on human beings that have ever been conducted by any officer or agency of the US government. An unknown number of people died under his experiments. He effectively was given a license to kill by the US government. And this has led me to conclude that he was probably the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century.
Wow. Wow. So I had to share for our audience the story about how I connected with you. Okay, yes, we're both associated with Brown. You're a professor, I'm a Brown grad. But the real way I got hold of you was I was contacted by another healer. Now, here we are again at the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. So here we talk about how to heal yourself naturally and all these wonderful modalities that people all over the world use to be healthy without drugs or surgery. We have great respect for medical doctors. I always say I've come from 5 generations of medical doctors, but we're talking about natural healing. So I got contacted out of the blue by a fellow healer who's an expert in trauma and healing from trauma. And she and I got to talking, and I was like, and she asked me, well, I've been doing this work for, gosh, nearly 29 years in natural healing. And she got into natural healing because her family had been a victim of MK Ultra when she was a child. And so she started telling me about this. And I was like, what? Why have I not heard about this? And so I sought you out, and I thought this would be a really fascinating subject to talk about. So we're going to be talking about MK Ultra. And then in addition to that, I have interviewed a number of people from all over the world who are experts in plant medicines. So there are people all over the world who are looking to use plant medicines to heal the mind, to heal from addictions and depressions and anxieties and, all these serious problems. So first of all, as we dive deeper into your fascinating book, Stephen Kinzer, and this is your 10th book. I've published 10, you published 10. I dare say your books are going to be far more gripping, especially this. So let's talk about Sidney Gottlieb. So first of all, who was he?
I called my book Poisoner in Chief because Sidney Gottlieb had that role for the US government. He came into the CIA in the early 1950s and lived in deep cover. Nobody ever heard of him. Even at the CIA, he was a very mysterious figure. Now, in the mid-1970s, there was a series of revelations about the CIA, and there were hearings in Washington. And one of the things that interested the senators in those days was CIA assassination plots. We remember we were trying to poison Fidel Castro. We made poison to kill Patrice Lumumba, the prime minister of the Congo. So the Senate was interested in this. And that's when the name of Sidney Gottlieb first appeared in public. He was the person who knew more about poisons than anyone in the United States, maybe anyone in the world. So he was the chief of the chemical branch of the CIA. Anytime anybody needed a poison, he was the guy that they would go to, and he would make it into a poison pen or a poison pill or a poison powder. He made all sorts of bizarre poison devices. I want to just mention one detail of his poisons. He really was fascinated by poisons and toxins. And you mentioned plant medicines. Needless to say, anybody interested in truly deadly toxins would look at the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. And Sidney Gottlieb did. He was having people bring him back the gallbladders of alligators from Africa. And at one point, Sidney Gottlieb was asked to make a poison to give to the pilots of the U-2 spy plane that was flying over the Soviet Union. In case they got captured, they could kill themselves. So he made a potent botulinum poison that he fabricated in his laboratory after extracting minute amounts of toxin from several thousand Alaskan butter clams. So this is the extent. He was getting people sending him back bark and leaves and all sorts of plants that he could experiment with in his laboratories. So how do I get from there to MK Ultra? I got interested in the story of him making poisons for foreign leaders because I write about US overthrows of foreign governments. Then I saw that the CIA had sent poison to the Congo, and it was Gottlieb who actually carried it there, making him, I'm sure, the only US government employee who's ever carried poison to another country for the express purpose of assassinating the leader of that country. But the more I looked into Gottlieb, the more I realized that what they were focusing on him for, making the poisons to kill foreign leaders, was not his big job. He was just a pharmacist. He fabricated poisons. If he weren't there, somebody else could have made the poisons. But MK Ultra was different. MK Ultra was super intense, and it all came out of Gottlieb's mind. He was totally unsupervised. And when I started understanding its scope and the wild things and drug combinations and torments that he used in experiments all over the world, I thought the poison part is just a piece of it. Being poisoner in chief of the CIA and therefore of the US government also gave him this extraordinary license to run this amazing MK Ultra project. I'm painfully aware that because many of the records were destroyed, I've only discovered a piece of what MK Ultra was and what Sidney Gottlieb did, but it's still quite a chilling story, and Poisoner in Chief tries to put together everything that's known so far about who he was and what he did.
So for our audience, can you explain what was MK Ultra? And is it still around? I mean, this definitely sounds like the stuff of James Bond movies and Jason Bourne, and
it's very much in that line. And some of the people involved in this work were steeped in those stories, or at least earlier versions of them. So MK Ultra, as I said, was handed over to Sidney Gottlieb. The reason he wasn't supervised and was allowed to go out and kill as many people as he wanted without asking anybody's permission is that in the CIA and also in other secret services, part of the code is that ignorance can be an asset. You don't want to know everything. It compromises you. People who were immediately above Gottlieb at the CIA, including the CIA director, Alan Dulles, they knew that Gottlieb was conducting horrific experiments. It must be. And they gave him permission, but they didn't want to know the details so that later on they could say they didn't know. And that Gottlieb had gone crazy, he went way off the rails, which of course is exactly what they did say. So what was he doing? He had two sets of experiments, some in the United States and some that he would conduct abroad. The ones abroad were particularly gruesome because the subjects were what he called the expendables. He wouldn't be allowed to go to, say, Germany or the Philippines or South Korea and tell the CIA station to requisition some prisoners. I want some human beings. So these would be suspected enemy agents or perhaps refugees who were not connected to anybody and wouldn't be missed and had been arrested. And Gottlieb would be supplied with these people. And what did he do with them? He was trying to find out a way to destroy a human mind and a human body and human spirit, a human soul. So what he used an amazing combination of torments. He would use sensory deprivation, lock people into coffin-like cells. Then, for example, feed them massive overdoses of sedatives so they'd fall into a deep coma. Then inject them with massive doses of amphetamines so that they would go wild. And in the in-between phase, between coma and hyperactivity, he would subject them to electroshock at exceedingly high temperatures and hope that all this together would destroy a person's mind, which I'm sure it would. And I'll tell you a chilling story. So I went to Germany when I was researching my Poisoner in Chief book. Gottlieb did a lot of work there. In Germany, I found what I think might be the first CIA secret prison. It's the place where Gottlieb worked. So the guy who owns the house now is a young German businessman. He's made some condos in there. And he welcomed me in and he took me down into the basement. And he said, see these storage rooms? These were the cells where Gottlieb and his fellow doctors, including former Nazis, conducted experiments that actually were just continuations of the experiments that these Nazi doctors had been conducting only a few years earlier at concentration camps just down the road. And he also told me the older people who live around here all know what happened in this house. And sure enough, there was once an article in a German magazine, Der Spiegel, calling it the CIA torture house. And he said, those people have told me that people who were experimented to death have been buried in the forests around here in places that are now covered over by shopping malls and apartment blocks. So Gottlieb had the ability to torment people, all in the name of fighting communism. This, if you can make that leap, I think that might have been the rationale, that the danger was so great that the loss of a few lives or even a few hundred lives was small price to pay. And that shows you what happens when you get into the means, the ends justify the means argument.
So absolutely gripping information. And with that, and I know you're hanging on the edge of your seat to hear more, but we're going to take a very brief break to listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors, and we will be right back. Stephen Kinzer, author of 10 books, including the one we're discussing today, Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. So we're talking about what is MK Ultra. So can you summarize for our audience, what was MK Ultra? It was.
So as I said earlier, the goal of it was to find a technique of mind control. How could you make a person do something that in their heart they really didn't want to do? And Gottlieb was a relentless experimenter with all sorts of drugs and other techniques. He was especially interested in LSD. He was actually the first LSD maven in the United States. And he used his LSD in two ways. So first of all, Gottlieb was obsessed with the idea that a substance could be so powerful, despite being used in such small doses and be colorless and odorless. By his own account, he took LSD more than 200 times himself. It sometimes made me wonder when I saw how bizarre some of these torturous experiments were. Did he come up with some of these torments while he was tripping on acid? It's kind of a frightening thought. In any case, he was so interested in LSD that in 1953, Sidney Gottlieb persuaded the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD. And the CIA did this. They bought it from the Sandoz company in Switzerland. It was shipped to the United States. Gottlieb took control of it. Now, he used it, as I said, in two different kinds of experiments. First of all, they thought that this might be, as one of Gottlieb's fellow chemists wrote, the key that could unlock the universe, that this was it. LSD was going to be the mind control drug. After a while, they found out that they concluded correctly, obviously, that its effects are too unpredictable to be used in a way like this. But how did Gottlieb use his LSD? First of all, he wanted to see if it could be used to destroy human minds. Now, as I said, Gottlieb destroyed all the records of MK Ultra, 7 crates of them, when he left the CIA. That's a federal crime because it's destruction of federal property, but it's a much lesser crime than the crimes that probably would be documented in those cases. So he probably did the right thing to destroy them from his perspective. Now, we do have some clues, though, about some of the experiments. And here's one that was taking place with LSD. This shows you the extent to which he would go. Inside the United States, Gottlieb worked a lot with prison wardens because the prisoners were obvious subjects for him. They were reliant on the warden and could be given various emoluments and good time and better cells and so forth. So here's one experiment that Gottlieb carried out in the US prison in Lexington, Kentucky. He had 7 African-American inmates segregated into a cell and fed what were described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days. Now, upon reading this, I wondered to myself, first of all, we never know who these people are. There's never a name. So there's no way to find out. But I wonder, of course, if the question was, does that destroy a person's mind? My guess is definitely. You could hardly survive that. Then what happened to those people later? Were they ever released? Did they ever have the slightest idea what had happened to them? So these were the kind of horrific experiments that Gottlieb was using his LSD for. However, he also had another basket of LSD experiments, which were non-coercive. These were, Gottlieb wanted to know how ordinary people would respond to LSD. And so therefore, he wanted to have volunteers come into clinics and hospitals and try it under controlled circumstances. Since the CIA does not have its own clinics and hospitals, Gottlieb set up a couple of bogus medical foundations that were actually CIA fronts for MK Ultra. They contacted hospitals and clinics in various parts of the United States and told them straightforwardly, we have this new psychoactive drug, it's called LSD. We're going to pay you to do some research for us. What you would do is we send you the LSD, you advertise it, you tell people what it is, you pay them if they're volunteers with money that we will provide, and then you just write reports of how they reacted. So given the attraction, a big market for this kind of research grew up quickly. And it was amazing for me when I was writing Poisoner in Chief to look back at who were among the very first volunteers who came in. So one of them was Allen Ginsberg. He got his first LSD at one of these clinics that got it from the CIA. Same thing for, and he, of course, he went on to become a great LSD propagandist. Robert Hunter, the guy who wrote the songs for the Grateful Dead. He was an early volunteer. He brought it home. He turned the whole Grateful Dead world onto LSD. Ken Kesey, the guy that wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was one of the first volunteers. And he loved it so much that he got a job in the hospital. And as he later wrote, I did it to steal the LSD so I could bring it home to my friends. So they, I found an interview with John Lennon in which he was asked about LSD. And he said, we must always remember to thank the CIA. Now, he had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb, but if he had, he would have said, we should always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb. And the irony, of course, is that the drug that Gottlieb thought would give the CIA the tool to rule the world wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA believed in.
What irony. Now, you mentioned that the MK Ultra experiments in Germany also had people participating who had been involved in Nazi experiments.
Yes.
So what is the connection between MK Ultra and Nazi and people who were involved with the Nazi movement?
This is an amazing part of the MK Ultra story, and this part is researchable. So I was able to find a lot out about this. So here's the story. I told you that Gottlieb was kind of a scientist and approached this project as a scientist would. And one of the first realizations that he made, as anybody would embarking in a project like this, was, I got to find out what information is already out there. So I want to catch up with the latest research. So the latest research in my field. But what is my field? My field is how to destroy a human body, how to destroy a human being, how to wipe away a mind. So we don't have a lot of information about that. How do you kill a person with certain kinds of chemicals? So we don't know that. And it's very hard for us to get that kind of information. But I do know who does know that stuff. It was the Nazi doctors who worked in the concentration camps, along with their Japanese counterparts, who I discovered were doing things that were, in some cases, even more horrific than what the Nazis were doing in the concentration camps. So Gottlieb went out and decided, I gotta hire the best people in my field. I got to hire the leading scientists. The US government had already, under a program called Operation Paperclip, given permission for the CIA to hire former Nazi spies. And then it had given permission for NASA to hire former Nazi rocket scientists. So it was just the next step to let MK Ultra bring in some former Nazi doctors. So Gottlieb was working shoulder to shoulder with these people. He sat with them, he learned from them. Former Nazi doctors and concentration camp torturers actually came to the US to lecture to American intelligence officers. For example, I found one lecture in which one of the questions was about sarin gas, a very potent toxin. And the question is, do you need as much sarin gas to kill a baby as you need to kill an adult? Now, an interesting scientific question, but we don't have any information about that. But they came over and gave us the information. They knew. They said it's the same amount. You need the same amount for a child. Nobody thought to ask, well, wait a minute, what did you have to do in order to find out that piece of information? Mm-hmm. So for me, talk about ironies in the Sidney Gottlieb story. Gottlieb was the child of Jewish immigrants from Central Europe. And so if his parents had not immigrated, if they had stayed in Central Europe, Gottlieb might likely have been picked up in one of those Nazi roundups of Jews. And he could have wound up in a concentration camp as a victim for one of those so-called experiments by one of those Nazi doctors. But in the event, as it went the other way, he didn't seem to have any problem working shoulder to shoulder with the Nazis who carried out those same experiments.
Well, another reason that I wanted to interview you, Stephen Kinzer, is that so many people are looking for, well, I'll call it substances, chemical substances to heal the mind, to relieve anxiety, to relieve depression, to overcome alcoholism. So I really wanted to ask you, what did the CIA research show about LSD to start out with?
One of the things that is very striking to me about Gottlieb's obsession with LSD and his fascination with it is that he was never interested in it for any kind of therapeutic purpose. Even the inventor of LSD, Albert Hofmann, one of his first observations was this could be very valuable for mental health treatments. That was already figured out within months after LSD was first discovered. But Gottlieb was not interested in any of that. He was interested in it only as a coercive tool. I'll just tell you one of the crazy projects that he came up with. He decided that he wanted to just figure out if using LSD and combining it with sex would produce a phenomenon in which men would talk more freely. And so he set up a bordello in San Francisco on Chestnut Hill, and on Chestnut Street, on Telegraph Hill. And he had several women picking up men. They would bring them to this apartment, which was all made up in nice French bordello style. And someone would be watching through a one-way mirror. And then those men would be fed whatever drug combination that Gottlieb wanted to test that week. And some fat drug agent would be sitting on a portable toilet in the next room watching it while drinking cocktails out of a pitcher. And this was supposed to be scientific research aimed at helping America resist communism. This was called Operation Midnight Climax. And it really shows you the extent to which he was willing to go. You know, while he was working in California, one of the local sheriff's deputies was invited to a party. He was apparently drugged. He didn't know what happened to him. He went down to his locker, took out his service revolver, went to the first bar and tried to rob it. He was hit over the head. He was brought to court and it never really worked again. No one knew what happened to him. The guy said, why? People were saying, why did you pull a gun? And it came up 20 years later in a court deposition. Oh yeah, well, you never go back and check on those guys, said one of the MK Ultra officers. You just let them go and you just hope they never complain. So this guy was one of several people whose lives were completely ruined by being given LSD or some other substance without their knowledge. And as I said, I go back to that first point. Gottlieb was never interested in the healing potentials of any drugs. He only saw them as military and security and coercive tools. So now that I'm thinking about it, Poisoner in Chief is a good title for my book, not just because he made poisons. It actually kind of poisoned our whole discourse around psychoactive drugs.
Fascinating. And again, we're still hanging on the edge of our seats. So hang in there with us as we listen to another message from one of our commercial sponsors. Stephen Kinzer, professor at Brown University of International Relations, author of 10 books, and we're talking about your 10th book, Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. So what other substances, in addition to LSD, did the CIA do research about? What other psychoactive substances?
Well, Gottlieb never found a drug that he didn't like. He was fascinated when psilocybin was finally fabricated. The whole magic mushroom phenomenon totally fascinated him. And as a matter of fact, there's a hidden CIA connection to that whole story. The magic mushrooms were first reported in the United States, as many of your viewers may know, in a big article in Life magazine, came out in 1956. A guy named Gordon Wasson, who was a very famous psychologist, went to Mexico with a couple of other people and found the magic mushrooms and wrote about it, and that kind of started the whole interest. What no one knew, even at Life magazine, and even Gordon Wasson himself didn't know, is that the guy who had arranged the funding, who came along, was actually working for the CIA. He was working for Sidney Gottlieb, who was also interested in the mushrooms, for very different reasons. And then, so how does this spin out? That article about magic mushrooms fascinated a lot of people. One of them was Timothy Leary. Tim Leary then went to Mexico because of that, found the magic mushrooms, used them, and that sent him off on that great path of being the Pied Piper of LSD. So a little bit indirectly, it was also Sidney Gottlieb who started Tim Leary on his road, because because of Gottlieb that expedition to Mexico was first funded, because the CIA wanted to know those stories. Gottlieb was sending people into jungles all over the world to talk to native peoples and find out the secrets of their medicine. So in that sense, he was far ahead of his time, because doctors and physicians in the West were scorning natural medicines during that period. But as I said, the flip side of it was that he only wanted those medicines for their negative potential, not for anything that they might do to help people. You know, you asked earlier, could something like this still be going on? So I conclude this: MK Ultra lasted for maybe a little less than a decade. It faded away in the late 50s and early 60s. And Gottlieb actually wrote at the end that he had concluded mind control is a myth. You cannot do it. So essentially he said, oh, forget everything I did. I'm sorry, it didn't work out. We experimented, but never mind. So as he wrote, you cannot convince someone to commit a murder by waving a watch in front of them or giving them a pill if they're deeply opposed to committing murder. So I think he was right. There is no such thing as mind control. However, he was right when he said it. That was around 1960. Think of the advances in cyber technology and artificial intelligence that have been made since then. The idea of dropping a pill in a drink belongs to ancient history. That's a long time ago. methods of potential mind control are so much more sophisticated now that even a non-specialist like me can't even really imagine them. So if I now realize, as a result of writing Poisoner in Chief, that this amazing project was going on under deep cover in the CIA in the 1950s, can I now dismiss the possibility that in the 2020s, there's some program investigating mind control underway at the CIA and perhaps in other secret services? I mean, based on my experience, I'd be very foolish to do that.
Right. So we're not really sure, but possibly, right?
That's the way the CIA likes things.
We're not sure. Not really sure what they're doing. So bottom line, what you're saying is that Sidney Gottlieb, the founder of this MK Ultra group, never looked at the therapeutic purposes for these different medicines. But paradoxically, the work that MK Ultra and the CIA did launched the whole search for plant medicine as a means to heal the mind.
You're absolutely right. This is another little untold chapter of Gottlieb's story. He was really a pioneer in researching plant medicine. The only difference was he wanted to use the medicine to hurt you instead of to heal you. But it's not that, in terms of research, those two are not so far separated. It's only when you get further up the line that the good and the bad get separated. So he might have been one of the first Americans who recognized the astonishing variety of natural products that were out there in plants and in animals that could be used for human health. Really, he was a fascinating figure. And this is another piece that makes him so amazing. It has to do with the contrast between what he did for a living and his private life. So Gottlieb did not live like any civil servant in Washington in the 1950s. He lived in a proto-eco home way out in the Virginia countryside with no running water. He got up before dawn to milk his goats. He studied Zen. He wrote poetry. They made their own bread. He grew his own vegetables. He was like a proto-hippie. And after he left the CIA, he devoted himself to his community service. He worked in prisons. He worked in a hospice. He worked in hospitals helping sick people. He had a speech impediment. He stuttered. And so he worked with kids who had speech impediments. So he has had this very compassionate image in his hometown. And I sometimes wonder how these can coexist. Did he, when he crossed the bridge over the Potomac on his way home, did he go through some kind of a transition where he left it all behind and then got into this loving father and community leader identity? I'd have to ask a psychologist to try to explain that one to me.
So if you were to estimate, based on your extensive research in your book, Poisoner in Chief, how many people do you think MK Ultra killed or harmed as being people who were experimented on?
It's very hard to make that estimate. I'm sure if I were to say dozens or scores, it would easily be true. Hundreds, I would say it's probably likely if you consider not just those who were the expendables abroad, but all the people that he experimented on in prison. And we have very few accounts of people that were victims because it didn't come until much later that even anyone knew this project existed. But one of the guys who was a victim while he was a prisoner in Atlanta, Georgia, was the famous Boston gangster Whitey Bulger. He had been told that he would get special privileges in prison if he participated in an experiment aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. He did volunteer, but he was given this drug that he later wrote totally destroyed his mind, and he saw these fantastic visions. He said he didn't want to tell anybody what had happened to him because he thought then he would never be out of prison for the rest of his life. They would consider him mad. But for the rest of his life, he could never sleep without the light on. He had all these tormenting nightmares. And in the mid-1970s, 20 years later, finally news of the existence of MK Ultra leaked out. And Bulger realized, this is what happened to me. That Dr. Pfeiffer in Atlanta, he was working for the CIA, for Gottlieb. And he told the members of his gang in Boston, I'm going to Atlanta. I'm going to find that Pfeiffer and I'm going to kill him. Now, he never did, although Pfeiffer did die a little young. I wondered about that, this strange accident. But it shows you the intensity. And what Bulger writes is just one person in one prison suggests that in a number of prisons and abroad, the number of Gottlieb's victims very likely would have been in the hundreds at least.
I read about Whitey Bulger, and apparently someone who had been on a jury who convicted Whitey Bulger for his actual crimes said that if after the verdict, if she had known that that Whitey Bulger had been a victim of the CIA and the MK Ultra project, she's not sure that she would have actually convicted him.
It's true. I found that and reported that in my book, that some lawyers in Boston were speculating on why Bulger didn't use this as a defense. Yes, I killed those people, but don't forget, the CIA made me crazy by overdosing me with LSD. There was a lot of evidence against him, so he didn't really have much of an other defense, but that never came up. And it's a very interesting question whether Bulger didn't want it to come up or why. Nonetheless, I lament it because it would have been at least a chance for more about MK Ultra to have been put out on the public record. As it stands, Poisoner in Chief is really the only account of it. And as I said earlier, due to the fact that so many records were destroyed, it's a maddeningly partial account. But I can tell you, it was a difficult one to write because when you write a biography, you're really living in the room with the person you're writing about. And this was not a comfortable roommate. A lot of bad stories.
So whatever happened, Stephen Kinzer, author of Poisoner in Chief, whatever happened to this mysterious poisoner, Sidney Gottlieb? What happened to it?
Very interesting end story. So, as I said, Gottlieb left the CIA in the mid-1970s, along with his mentor, Richard Helms, who was then the director of the CIA. They together agreed to destroy the MK Ultra records. But in the mid-1970s, just a few years after he left, CIA investigations began. Gottlieb was called back from India, where he was working in a leper hospital, to come back to Washington and testify in secret about the plots to poison Castro. Some of this information leaked into the public, but he was able to fade back into obscurity. He moved back to Virginia. He became a kind of a community leader and a guy that walked around in his clogs and looked for ways to help others. But then something happened that might have been inevitable. After news of MK Ultra began to leak out into the media in the 70s, several people, as I said, came to realize that they were victims. One of them was a guy who had been studying art in Paris when he was called into a bar, and a guy who has a limp, Sidney Gottlieb also had a limp, brought him a free drink. After he drank that drink, he had a nervous breakdown. He became a kind of a hermit. He went back to New York. He never again read a book, never had a relationship. He was kind of a street person who lived on his front steps the rest of his life. Really, he had his mind destroyed. It's speculated that he was targeted by Gottlieb because he had hepatitis, and there was a feeling that LSD would be particularly devastating for people that had hepatitis. And so maybe they wanted to use him as an example, and it certainly turned out to be true. It totally ruined his life. So when the first news of MK Ultra came out, this guy's sister called him and said, hey, I think I figured it out. You said a drink, you said a limp, you said, this is it. So they started a lawsuit against the CIA and against Gottlieb. This lawsuit went through the courts for 20 years. You can imagine. And the guy died. The person who had been the victim died. But the sister, with the sort of help of the lawyer, and wanted to pursue the case anyway, they kept the case going. And sure enough, finally, after 20 years of depositions and delays, the case was about to come to trial. This was the very beginning of 1999. Gottlieb was a named defendant. He was going to have to sit in a court chair under oath and talk not only about whether he had poisoned this one guy, but MK Ultra. And that would have just devastated the CIA and the image of the United States. Just as the trial was about to begin, Gottlieb died. Now,
How did he die? How did he die?
Well, the cause of death was not released, never announced, nor was the burial place. However, I went to see the lawyer who had followed the case for 20 years and had a whole garage full of documents. And he said, I'm sure Gottlieb committed suicide. He fell on his sword. He didn't want to be the instrument by which all of this came out. And I talked to the son of one of his other victims. He said, I agree with that. I think that's what happened. I found a couple of notes in which Gottlieb in other episodes had told people when he gave them poison to use on someone, don't worry, with what's in here, no one will ever know that the person has even been poisoned. They'll think it's a natural disease because of the way I made it. So if there was ever anyone who could poison himself or anyone else with some very sophisticated device that could never, or compound that could never be detected in autopsy, it was Sidney Gottlieb. I mean, he was smarter than anybody that ever conducted an autopsy. So, and then the body we gather was cremated, so immediately. So we don't know the circumstances of death, but it is interesting that it happened in this way at this particular time, just as Gottlieb might have been called to what could have been an epochal trial.
So Stephen Kinzer, author of Poisoner in Chief, professor of international relations at Brown University, as you have spent considerable research and time writing this fascinating book, what is your personal conclusion about mind control? Is mind control possible?
I don't think it's possible under the conditions that most of us are familiar with. That is hypnotism or drug compounds that could completely reorder a person's mind like you see in the movies. They're a favorite trope. I mean, you'll never stop having movies and books and short stories about hypnosis and mind control. It's a fascinating subject, but it's really divorced from reality. But as I said earlier, I now wonder, what about the propaganda machine that overwhelms us every day? Mm-hmm. What about the power that a few billionaires have over the discourse that we follow? What about the penalties that people pay for speaking out against the mainstream narratives? You know, isn't this a kind of mind control? And you know, I gave a speech once about this book in which I said Gottlieb actually wanted to brainwash the world, but he found out there was no such thing as brainwashing. And the first question actually came from one of my colleagues at Brown. She raised her hand and she said, I think you might be mistaken. Gottlieb, you say Gottlieb never managed to brainwash anyone, but I think you're wrong. He got to brainwash himself. He brainwashed himself into believing that he had to go out and torture and kill people in order to save America from communism. Oh. And that's a form of self-brainwashing, which is probably the most dangerous kind of brainwashing there is.
So fascinating. And it's really, again, there are people alive today who have been victims of MK Ultra. And unfortunately, this is the continued work, as you said, of Nazi doctors and Japanese doctors from the concentration camps. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today has been Stephen Kinzer, author of 10 books, including Poisoner in Chief, You can find out more about Stephen Kinzer and his fascinating, life-changing work at his website, stephenkinzer.com. And remember, natural healing works, and you can heal yourself naturally. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.